Hello everyone and welcome to the first Blogic not Canadian Highlander set review. I know the Strixhaven spoilers are in full effect. I'm super excited for that set, but that set review is coming in 2 weeks' time, the next post. For today, however, now that the introductory articles, blog posts, whatever you want to call them, are over with and people now understand what the format is and what the format is about, we're going to finally talk about Kaldheim. Kaldheim. Right there. Right there. I understand that this is a little bit late, but like I say, I wanted to make sure that people knew what the format was about so that they could evaluate cards, think about cards in the right way before talking about them. Before we get started, I'm just going to say we're going through Wooburg, White, Red, Black, Red, Green, and then we're going through Gold, and then we're going through Artifacts and Lands. It's going to be 5 cards from each of the mono colours, 10 gold cards, and then 10 artifacts/lands. I just wanted to sort of make sure that I didn't need to feel the need to talk about every card in the set, but could talk about some of the more exciting cards as well as a few that, even if their homes are kind of obvious, they are obviously powerful cards and deserve bringing to the forefront, as we'll see later on. There are some cards that are very obvious what deck they go into, but I couldn't not talk about them. Whereas some cards that are still powerful, but also still have an obvious deck, I didn't really feel the need to talk about. A lot of the elf cards, for example, I'm not going to be talking about, because although a lot of the elf cards in the set are quite good, they go in an elf deck, and that's really all you can say about it. So I didn't feel the need to include those. But anyway, let's stop beating about the bush and let's start the set review. The first card we are looking at is Doomscar. Doomscar is 3 white for a sorcery that says destroy all creatures and has Foretell for 1 white. Foretell means that during your turn, anytime during your turn, you can do it at instant speed. You can exile the card specifically from your hand, face down, and on a later turn, you can cast it for its Foretell cost. So rather than a 5 mana Wrath, you have a 3 mana Wrath. Wraths are becoming less and less common in Canadian Highlander, just because like the threats are getting better, the decks that they're especially good against normally are becoming a lot more resilient to them, and just generally when they're in high numbers, they're expected and they're played around more. So nowadays you tend to see decks playing like 2 or 3. I currently play in blue-white control, which is like the Wrath deck. I believe 3. I believe I play Supreme Verdict, Terminus, and Settle the Wreckage. Terminus and Settle the Wreckage allow me to get rid of creatures in more permanent ways, rather than just putting them in the graveyard for them to be reanimated or brought back in other ways. And Supreme Verdict is Supreme Verdict. It's the best Wrath, basically, of all time. Doomscar, I think, is a very good Wrath. I would probably put it in the top 5 if you put Wrath of God and Damnation as like essentially the same card. But yeah, it's high up there. It's certainly, in my opinion, I think the best 5 mana Wrath. Fumigate and Cleansing Nova are both good for different reasons, but I think just generally, as 5 mana Wraths go, this is probably the best, because at worst, you can foretell it for 2 and then play it for 3 on a future turn. So if your opponent has a very aggressive start, you can, if you have it in your opening hand, play it on turn 3 if absolutely necessary. Or even just putting it face down. A lot of the time your opponent will know what it is. I don't see a ton of Foretell cards being massively playable in the format, and even then, a lot of them, most of the cards with Foretell that would see play, you don't really care about foretelling them. So against a blue-white deck, for example, your opponent's going to know or have a feeling it's Doomscar, which can possibly work to your advantage, because it means that your opponent's probably going to take the game a little bit slower and not apply to the board as much, so you can try and pick them off with spot removal or slow them down with planeswalkers and the like. But yeah, I don't expect to be playing this card a ton, personally, but at the same time it wouldn't surprise me if the card did see play, and I still fully expect to get wrapped by this card every so often. Next up, we have Glorious Protector. Glorious Protector is 2 white for a 3/4 Angel Cleric. It has flash, flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of non-angel creatures you control until it leaves the battlefield. It has foretell for 2 and a white. So it's probably, as previously mentioned with Doomscar, I don't really see myself ever foretelling this card. It's just going to be a 4-mana 3/4 flash flyer at worst. And at best, this is very good at protecting your board from a wrath like Doomscar. I think it's mostly going to see play in white decks that want to make a wide board. The easiest comparison is to Restoration Angel. I don't think that this is as good as Restoration Angel and not as splashy as Restoration Angel. It has 2 white pips as opposed to the 1 that Restoration Angel does. And Restoration Angel is very good at protecting your small boards from spot removal. Whereas this, it can protect things from spot removal, but then you're not instantly going to get it back. It will sort of replace something, if anything. The fact it can exile multiple things, like I say, makes it very good against Wraths. And so I think in decks like Abzan Midrange or in Death and Taxes that often quite like to make slightly wider boards, I think this is going to be very good. I expect this card to see quite a bit of play. I like it a lot. But at the same time, I don't think it goes in every deck. We have Halvor God of Battle, 2 white for a 4/4 legendary god. Creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. At the beginning of each combat, you may attach target aura or equipment attached to a creature you control to target creature you control. And on the reverse side, we have Sword of the Realms, 1 and a white for a legendary artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has vigilance, and whenever a equipped creature dies, return it to its owner's hand. It has equip for 1 and a white. If you are not aware, how this card works is that when casting the card, you essentially choose which side you're casting. It's not like the werewolves, for example, where it transforms. You choose which side you are casting. Let's talk about Sword of the Realms first, because I think it's the most interesting half, but I think the weakest half, for reasons I'll get into in a second. The effect is very good. I really like the effect. The equipped creature getting +2/+0 and vigilance. A lot of white creatures have inbuilt flying, have inbuilt first strike, have inbuilt double strike, so not giving toughness is a little unfortunate, but really not the end of the world. Vigilance as well means that obviously it's going to attack and block, which is very nice. You can put other equipment on it, so like swords, to make it a really annoying blocker for the opponent as well as attacker. And even if you don't have other equipment and stuff like that attached to it, equipping it to the right creature means your opponent might not want to attack into it because of that clause of when the creature dies, you return it to your hand. I think this card is going to be very, very good when equipped on cards like Stoneforge Mystic, Recruiter of the Guard, Ranger Captain of Eos, Flicker Wisp. Cards that, once they have entered the battlefield, they've done their job, and then they're just a body. So being able to reuse their effects is really handy. That being said, as much as I like this card, the reason it is awkward is because in Death and Taxes is very good at finding either small creatures or finding equipment. Because of Recruit of the Guard, as I mentioned, Ranger Captain of Eos, Stoneforge Mystic. What it isn't very good at finding is 4/4s. And because on the front side, the way that this works is the card is, with the modal double face cards, is whatever the front side is, the cards are always that type while in other zones in your graveyard, in your deck. So you cannot fetch the sword with Stoneforge Mystic because you are looking then at Halvor God of Battle, a 4/4 legendary creature. This does mean that you can find it with cards like Eladamri's Call, for example, but obviously Death and Taxes often doesn't splash green, and so yeah, you can't look for it that way. A card we won't be talking about today, but a card that is in the set, and I could see seeing a little bit of play in Death and Taxes, is Search for Glory, which allows you to search for a legendary card. And so maybe that's a way to find Halvor. However, let's get into Halvor. I don't think we've been talking about Death and Taxes and how I like the sword in Death and Taxes. The reason I don't think this card's going to see a lot of play is because I don't particularly like Halvor, at least in Death and Taxes, which is where I think the sword would be best. Creatures you control that are enchanted or equipped having double strike, that's not going to come up as massively often. You will obviously have equipped creatures, and that will be nice, but you don't often have enchanted creatures. And that second ability, it'd be nice to be able to move stuff around, but like Death and Taxes, for example, isn't a equipment or enchantment based, aura based deck. 4 mana 4/4 legendary as well that doesn't do anything really the turn it comes into play is a little bit awkward in a format where you have Karakas. That being said, I think that this card is going to be very good when we finally get the required density of cards for a red white or a Naya heroic double strike equipment deck. There is something nearly there. There are lists that exist that I think are sort of just below the tier. If you consider like tier 1 as like staples of the format, tier 2 where it's like they're not really going to be staples, but these decks are like good and you are going to win more than you lose. I think that the equipment deck is like tier 2.5, tier 3. It's nearly there. We just need some extra cards. And one of the biggest issues with the deck is that it often draws a bunch of creatures and no equipment, so you're playing a bunch of creatures that aren't the best, or you draw a bunch of equipment and minimal creatures, which means that you have a bunch of unusable equipment. Halvor solves this problem wonderfully, because he is, of course, a creature and an equipment. So I really like Halvor. I really like his design. I don't think he has a home at the moment, but he is a card that I will have my eye on over the next year or two. Next up, we have my personal favourite card from the set at the moment, Redane. Ray Skywalker Dane. I call her Redane. I honestly don't know how to pronounce her, so we're just going to go with Redane. Redane, God of the Worthy, 2 and a white for a 2/3 legendary god. Flying, Vigilance, snowlands your opponent control enter the battlefield tapped, and non-creature spells your opponents cast with converted mana cost 4 or greater cost 2 generic, more to cast. And on the flip side, we have Valkyrie, Protector's Shield. 3 and a white gets you a legendary artifact. If a source an opponent controls would deal damage to you, or a permanent you control, prevent 1 of that damage. And whenever you or another permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 1. Again, I will start with the reverse side. I really like Valkyrie. I think Valkyrie is a really cool card to have the option of playing. The thing I love most about modal double face cards is that, for the most part, one of the sides will be, this is decent but maybe not amazing, and the reverse side will be, like, very good in situational circumstances, and I think that Redane fits that description to a T. I think that Valkyrie's first ability is extremely good against the right deck, so against Burn, for example, obviously, and red deck wins. It's a really nice card to have, but it's not a card that you want to put in your deck on its own. And that second ability can be quite good against Storm, for example, or even quite good against Control. And, like I say, it's a card that I would never put in my deck. I would never put in my deck a 4-mana artifact that was, maybe good in this matchup at the right time, maybe good in this matchup and with certain circumstances were met. However, the thing is that this card, Valkyrie, that I really like, is attached to Redane, and I think that Redane is absolutely fantastic. First of all, 3 mana for a 2/3 flying vigilance body. That's fine. It's nothing to write home about. It doesn't quite pass the vanilla test, but it's still a pretty good body. Snowlands your opponent controls enter the battlefield tapped is a line of text that won't come up a lot, especially depending on how your opponent has built their deck, but it can make things very awkward for the opponent. I have had several turns playing with Redane, where it still laid my opponent's wrath for a turn, and I have had several games playing against Redane, where it's made my land fetching quite awkward, because I've had to play around the fact that, oh, if my opponent plays Redane next turn, I can't do this, or I can't do that, and sometimes there's been times against a deck, for instance, I play it in Jeskai Flyers, and I was playing against my friend playing my Jeskai Flyers deck, and I had to fetch in a really awkward way where I ended up having to shock myself because they had a Redane in play, and they were threatening me, and I had to damnation as soon as possible. It was really awkward, and speaking of damnation, the reason it was so awkward was because of that last line of text. Non-creature spells your opponent's casting being 2 more if they're 4 or greater is horrible. Toxic Deluge is the only 3 mana wrath in the format that sees play. And so your opponent's Wrath of God, Supreme Verdict's Damnation, as I mentioned, their Planeswalkers like Jace the Mind Sculptor or Gideon Ally of Zendikar. These cards, these staples of the format, become really clunky. And that second line of text, the Snowlands line of text, just adds to that clunkiness. It means that they have to fetch their lands awkwardly and their cards are more expensive. And a 2/3 body, as I said, is like, it's not anything to write home about, but it's still a decently threatening body. And so she doesn't take over the game, as it were, but she changes the game around her in a way that, isn't unfun like an Oko or a Teferi 3, but makes her feel like she's constantly impacting the game, and I absolutely love her. Put her in your white decks, whether they're Death and Taxes, whether they're Abzan mid-range, whether they're green-white mid-range. Maybe not in control decks, but even then, it would not shock me to have my control opponent drop a Redane against me or a Valkyrie, because I do think the card's really, really good, and as I say, I think she's my favourite card from the set at the moment. Next up, we have Righteous Valkyrie. Righteous Valkyrie is 2 and a white for a 2/4 Angel Cleric with flying. Whenever another angel or cleric enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. And as long as you have at least 7 or more life than your starting life total, creatures you control get +2/+2. First thing I will say out of the gate is, I think of this card similar to how you think of a Planeswalker's ultimate, as that ultimate is like a cherry on top. I think the final ability of the +2/+2 is not something that you should expect to get often, but if you do get it, you are very, very happy. I compare this card quite a bit to Courser of Kruphix. Obviously, Courser of Kruphix is partially played because of the ability to, smooth out your draws by playing lands from the top of your library, but the main reason that Courser is so good is because of its 2/4 body and its inherent life gain. It makes it absolute hell for aggro decks especially, but even mid-range decks. Mid-range decks play plenty of free power creatures, and 4 toughness is like nothing to scoff at. The fact that it flies means that it can also get in, which is often an issue with Courser. It's like, right, cool, I've controlled the board, but I can't actually get in with it. This doesn't have that problem, and that inherent life gain, like Courser of Kruphix, is just going to accrue over time. There are so many creatures out there that are just incidentally clerics, and obviously a lot of angels also have high toughness. We talked about Glorious Protector earlier and Restoration Angel. There are a lot of angels that are just very playable in mid-range decks. We see Linvala showing up from time to time. If you play this in a deck with Geist of Saintraft, that could be really good. And as I say, clerics like Mother of Runes or Containment Priest in Death and Taxes, I think this card is very good in Death and Taxes, but even then, in mid-range decks, I think this card's perfectly fine. Any creature with lifelink obviously helps, and if you play something like, say, Umezawa's Jite, then you can get that 7 life up quite quickly. Obviously, you're going to be fetching and stuff like that, which is going to lower it, but like I say, don't play this card expecting to get that 3rd ability, but at the same time, you will probably get it a little, a bit more than you might expect, but not as often as you might hope. Saying that, I think this card is absolutely fantastic. I would definitely have considered playing the card even without that last line of text. So that last line of text being, you know, the cherry on top, as it were, is just absolutely fantastic. And again, I really, really like this card. That was the last card for white, by the way. I think white is absolutely fantastic in the set. I think we've got some really cool creatures and other tools like the Search for Glory that I mentioned earlier. I think white, a little bit of a spoiler for the rest of the set review, I think white got the best monocolour cards out of this set. I'm really, really excited for essentially all 5 of the cards that I talked about. Halvor less so, but I can see the potential there. I can see that he has a home that isn't quite ready yet. And, you know, if we get more cards like Halvor, there is definitely a deck for him, and I think he can be an absolute powerhouse in decks like that if they get there. I think the Glorious Protector is going to be seeing plenty of play. I think Righteous Valkyrie is going to be seeing plenty of play, and Redane is, like I say, it's my card from the card for the set, and I think Redane's going to become a white mid-range staple in the same way that Brimaz has, as an example. I think white's fantastic in this set. So moving on to blue, first up, we have Bind the Monster. Bind the Monster is a single blue for an aura enchant creature. When Bind the Monster enters the battlefield, tap the enchanted creature. It deals damage to you equal to its power. Enchanted creature doesn't tap during its controller's untap step. I play a lot of blue tempo decks. Flying Men and Sorensen are 2 of my favourite decks in the format, and one of the biggest issues they have is removing creatures. Both those decks are very susceptible to it's just getting blocked, essentially. Flying Men, especially. If your opponent puts, say, a Restoration Angel on board, you are kind of screwed because that has 4 toughness and it kills basically all of your creatures. Similarly, often Sorensen will have a very big creature, not necessarily with trample, and just needs to get that one last thwack in to win the game. And Bind the Monsters is very, very good at that. Obviously, it's not going to deal with every blocker in the world. You know, True Name Nemesis, for example, is famously good at blocking creatures. There are plenty of threats out there with hexproof nowadays. And it can easily be removed. However, decks like that at the moment are, you know, playing cards like Dismember and Unsummon as like their only removal. So a card like this that can deal with a creature for a longer amount of time than those cards, and can also deal with something with more than 5 toughness, unlike Dismember. I think this card's really good and shouldn't be overlooked. Next up, we have possibly the coolest design from the set. We have COSIMA, God of the Voyage. 2 and a blue gets you a 2/4 legendary god. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile COSIMA. If you do, it gains, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if COSIMA is exiled, you may put a voyage counter on it. If you don't put a voyage counter on it, you return COSIMA to the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it and draw X cards, where X is the number of voyage counters on it. And on the reverse side, we have the Omen Keel, which is 1 and a blue for a 3/3 legendary vehicle. Whenever a vehicle you control deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles that many cards from the top of their library. You may play lands from among those cards for as long as they remain exiled, crew 1. So let's talk about the Omen Keel first. I don't think the Omen Keel is going to see a ton of play, mostly because this is one of the few double-phased cards where the front side and the reverse side don't feel like they want to go into the same deck. The only deck that I think has any crossover with the 2 of them is a deck like Sorensen, the blue-green tempo deck of the format. However, I think COSIMA is too slow and too clunky for that deck. The deck is already a little bit clunky at times because of playing quite expensive low-power creatures that then get bigger over time, which COSIMA fits into, but the fact that you can only realistically play 1 land a turn, 2 if you play a fetch land, I guess, and it will take turn after turn after turn for her to become a realistic threat, and then even then you have a threat that doesn't have evasion, it's legendary so it can be bounced by Caracas. I don't think she really fits in Sorensen. And similarly, the Omen Keel wouldn't have been fantastic either. And so I don't really think that any deck's going to be running the Omen Keel and would also want COSIMA. Speaking of COSIMA, where I see COSIMA having a home and why I didn't really talk much about the Omen Keel is because I think that she could show up in low colour control decks like blue-red or blue-white control. Because those decks, they have sort of lessened playing cards like blue-white, for instance, doesn't really play Sphinx's Revelation anymore. And that's because Sphinx's Revelation was just too slow and too clunky, and even if you did it for like a low number, you were still spending like 5 mana to draw 2 and gain 2, which just really isn't worth it. COSIMA is a card that, as the game goes long, you're going to get more value out of her, but if you can't wait for too long, you still get a little bit of value out of her, and you're still left with a body which can block. Like she's a 3 mana 2/4, as we were talking about earlier with the Angel. 3 mana 2/4 is nothing to laugh about. That can block for a while, and if you get 1 counter on her, 2 counters on her, then she's gonna get quite big quite quickly. She might be too slow and she might be too clunky, but I think that there is a chance that we see her in control. While the Omen Keel, I don't think we'll be seeing anytime soon. Next up, we have Graven Law, 3 blue for a snow instant. Scry X, where X is the amount of snow mana spent to cast this spell, and then you draw 3 cards. Speaking of cards that are slow and clunky, this card is quite slow. It is 5 mana, and as I say, decks aren't really playing cards like Sphinx's Revelation anymore or anything like that. However, I think this card is specifically good in Blue Moon. Blue Moon is a deck that had already been playing Snowlands because of Skred, because that deck will take essentially any removal that it can. Because it doesn't have hard removal, it can often end up having to 2-for-1 itself to deal with big creatures, and so Skred helped it deal with big creatures. With even more snow cards being released in this set, it's got a few more tools to help with that. However, for instance, if there is a 5 toughness creature, its most common removal spells are 3 damage and the odd 4 damage spell, and so it will often have to find a way to deal damage to the creature and then follow that up with a 3 damage spell or a 4 damage spell, and so as I say, it can often 2-for-1 itself. So I think that Blue Moon in particular is more wanting of cards that let it draw multiple cards. That's the deck where I find myself playing more of the 4 mana draw 2s like Hieroglyphic Illumination. It likes Fact or Fiction, maybe the most out of any non-graveyard based control deck, and so I think Graven Law has a very real chance of fitting into the deck. Mystic Confluence is a card that is a 5 mana draw 3 with lots of other variations that you can do, and has been seeing less and less play. However, I think that, as I say, I think Blue Moon likes that card maybe the most of any control deck, and Graven Law being another 5 mana draw 3 with even more options because most of your lands are going to be snow, I think could really help the deck. Next up we have Mystic Reflection. Mystic Reflection is 1 and a blue for an instant. It says choose target non-legendary creature. The next time 1 or more creatures or planeswalkers enter the battlefield this turn, they enter as copies of the chosen creature, and it has Foretell for a blue. Obviously this card had quite a lot of hype for Commander, and in Canadian Highlander, while I don't think the card is unplayable, I don't think it's particularly good. In Canadian Highlander, situational cards aren't your friend. We don't have sideboards, and the format is fast enough that you often don't have time to set up the situations where your situational cards can be at their most powerful. Yes, you can turn your opponent's Oko into a lousy creature. Yes, you can screw over your Cradle Hoof opponent's, natural order turn. But most of the time, especially in blue decks, you're just going to have a counterspell for the thing anyway, and counterspells are obviously a lot more flexible and can hit a lot more things, and don't rely on the game to be in a particular place for your card to work. if you have this on an empty board and your opponent plays a big creature, you have nothing to turn that creature into. Even if it's, for instance, turning a game-winning threat into a less game-winning threat, yes, you're not going to lose the game that turn, but you still maybe turned their very powerful thing into a less powerful but still powerful thing that's going to kill you, rather than actually dealing with the threat. I very much expect to die to this card in some way at some point in my life, whether it's in Canlander or more likely in Commander, but I can't in any good conscience tell you to play this card. And finally for blue, we have Auvar the All-Form. 3 and a blue gets you a 3/3 legendary shapeshifter with Changeling. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, if it targets one or more other permanents you control, you create a token that's a copy of one of those permanents. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard this card, create a token that's a copy of target permanent. So this is the card from the set that I have the least information to give you, but am also the most excited for, because you just read Auvar and you just know there's something there. I don't have any specifics, I'm not going to lie. I don't think that this works in a deck with pump spells or the like, because it's a 4-mana 3/3 and legendary, which means that there are going to be plenty of times where it's very clunky. I don't think it goes in a Paradox and a Paradox Academy deck, as I've seen a few people mention, because a lot of the cards in that deck that actually would like to be copied are legendary. The 2 namesakes of the deck, for example, are legendary, so you can't make copies of them. So yeah, I'm not going to try and talk absolute rubbish to get my way through this. I honestly don't really have anything to say or a home for Auvar yet, but I couldn't not talk about it. You read the card and your mind starts going at 100 miles an hour of, what can I do, what can I do, can I do this, can I do that? And it's a card that will sit in my Canlander box for probably the next couple of years, and suddenly something will come out and will break it in half. And I honestly cannot wait for that to happen, and I fully expect to die to this at some point, but I have no idea what it will be doing, and that excites me. So that was it for blue. I like blue this set. There's a lot of interesting cards. Auvar and COSIMA being the main 2, where they don't have obvious homes at the moment, but their abilities are so unique and so powerful that I fully expect to die to them at some point, or to die because they were played. And I don't think that blue is particularly overpowered like it has been in some recent sets. Normally with another colour added on, true, but yeah, I think this card did blue very, very solidly. I don't think we've got any format staples from this set, but I think we've got cards that are going to be not necessarily role players, but good tools for blue decks for years to come. Next up, we'll be talking about black, and we're starting with Burning Rune Demon. 4 black gets you a 6/6 Demon Berserker. He has flying, and when Burning Rune Demon enters the battlefield, you may search your library for exactly 2 cards not named Burning Rune Demon that have different names. If you do, you reveal those cards. An opponent chooses one of them and puts the chosen card into your hand and the other into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. So in Canadian Highlander especially, searching for 2 cards is obviously extremely powerful, and the fact that one of the cards is going into your bin isn't often a downside. The obvious place for this is a Reanimator deck, where you can search for 2 reanimation spells, you can search for 2 reanimation targets, you can search for a reanimation target and an Unburial Rites. However, there is almost certainly, and unfortunately I don't have any particular examples right now, but there is almost certainly a deck that at some point will be able to not abuse this, but take very easy advantage of it, whether it's a land mid-range deck, whether it's a particular build of Dredge. Because if Entomb has taught us anything, it's that, as I say, putting a card in a bin in the right deck may as well be tutoring for it, and may even be cutting out some steps to do what you actually want to do with the card, whether it's reanimating it or taking advantage of, Dredge, for example, or something like that. So I really like Burning Rune Demon. I don't know if he has a home except for Reanimator just yet, but as we were talking about with COSIMA earlier, it is an obviously powerful card that at some point I think someone will not break, but find a way to get the full advantage and full power out of the card. Next up we have Draugr Necromancer. 3 and a black gets you a 4/4 Snow Zombie Cleric. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile that card with an ice counter on it instead. And you may cast spells from among cards in exile your opponents own with ice counters on them, and may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any colour to cast those spells. So first things first, let's get this out of the way. In my opinion, this is not Kalitas, Traitor of Get. If you want a 4-drop that hates on the graveyard and gets you value out of it, I would still play Kalitas over this. However, I could not mention this card because of the existence of medium decks, and how medium decks love their 4-drops, and especially 4-drops that have Ancient 2 mana or even Mana Vault mana. And this fully fits that bill. A 4 mana 4/4 with extra value is exactly what medium black enjoys. Medium black is often a bit of a clunky deck because black is very greedy on the pips normally, whereas this is not greedy on the pips at all. This has a single black pip. As I say, Mana Vault mana on a black creature is quite rare, and on a creature this strong, it's very, very welcome. I don't expect to see this card often, but when I do, it's a card that is going to make combat very, very interesting and very awkward if I'm playing a creature-based deck. So yeah, I don't think this card's anything to write home about for the format as a whole, but I think certain decks will really like this card. Next up, we have Egon. I'm going to go with Egon because that sounds cooler. So Egon, God of Death. 2 and a black gets you a 6/6 legendary god with Death Touch, because for some reason wizards have an obsession that if a creature is black and a 6/6 that it also needs Death Touch. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile 2 cards from your graveyard. If you can't, sacrifice Egon and draw a card. And the reverse is Throne of Death, a single black for a legendary artifact that says at the beginning of your upkeep, mill a card. 2 and a black, tap, exile a creature card from your graveyard, draw a card. I do not expect many people to be using Egon as Throne of Death. However, like as I will say with essentially every model double-face card I talk about, I am very glad the option is there. If I have to keep a slightly clunky hand in Dredge, but includes this card, you better be sure I am going to be playing Throne of Death on turn 1. It's not going to be particularly speedy, and it's still going to be a little bit clunky, and I don't expect to use that second ability particularly often, but I'll be happy when it's there at some point, certainly. Now let's talk about the real card. Egon is obviously not going to go in every deck. In fact, I think the only deck at the moment that she definitely fits in is Dredge, because I don't believe that medium black or even a land-based mid-range deck or Reanimator, I don't think they have the ability to fill their graveyard as easily and as regularly as Egon really requires, mainly because she says specifically, if you can't, not if you don't. She forces you to exile 2 cards from your graveyard. You do not have the choice. If there are 2 cards in your graveyard, you are exiling them. And so in Reanimator, that can obviously absolutely ruin you. It can also ruin you in Dredge, but Dredge is inherently designed to get as many cards in the graveyard as quickly as possible. So most of the time, that is not going to ruin you as much as it could. And so in Dredge, having access to a 3-mana 6/6 is, it's nothing to scoff at. The deck will often not need her, because the deck will be doing Dredge things, but sometimes you're forced to play a fair game with Jund, and so when you can take advantage of paying 3 mana for a 6/6 and getting to keep it around, that's absolutely great. She is no Rotting Regisaur, I will say that, but Rotting Regisaur, they decided to put a downside on it that ended up often being an upside, and they've clearly learned that, because Egon's downside is a downside, but not one that I think will stop her from seeing play. Next up, we have Valkyrie, God of Lies. 1 and a black gets you a 2/1 legendary god. And when Valkyrie enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand. For each opponent, exile a creature card they revealed this way until Valkyrie leaves the battlefield. And then for X, choose a creature card exiled with Valkyrie with converted mana cost X. Valkyrie becomes a copy of that card. And on the reverse, it was me all along, Austin. It's Tybalt, Cosmic Imposter. 5 black-red gets you a legendary Planeswalker Tybalt with 5 starting loyalty. As Tybalt enters the battlefield, you get an emblem, with you may play cards exiled with Tybalt, Cosmic Imposter, and may spend mana as though it were mana of any colour to cast those spells. +2, exile the top card of each player's library. -3, exile target artifact or creature. And -8, exile all cards from all graveyards and then add red, red, red. First thing first, I do not expect to be seeing many Tybalts, especially now that they have fixed the Cascade rule. However, as I will say with every modal double face card, I am glad the option is there. Tybalt is an extremely powerful Planeswalker. The fact that he gets an emblem, which means that even if you play him, exile your opponent's best threat, and then he dies, it means that suddenly that threat can still be cast. And that can swing games very, very much. The fact he exiles cards as well means that if you do manage to get a very timely, hit from the top card of your opponent's deck, say against Storm, you just happen to hit their Tendrils or their Thassa's Oracle, excuse me, that is going to make things very awkward for them. I don't expect that to come up much, but the fact that it's there is nice. Let's talk about Valkyrie. So obviously, because of the change to the Cascade rules, he is not as abusable as he used to be. However, I still think that Valkyrie is a solid creature. I don't think he's going to be a card that you're going to hear many stories starting with, oh my god, and then they played Valkyrie. But it could happen. The fact he only hits creatures is a little bit unfortunate, because a lot of the time, hand attack is best normally against combo decks and against control decks, where you often want to hit specific spells in their hand. You want to hit their Wrath, you want to hit their Tutor, you want to hit their payoff like Tendrils of Agony, and obviously he can't hit them. However, a 2-mana 2/1 body is still perfectly fine. If you do manage to hit, if you are against a mid-range deck, for example, and do manage to hit a big creature, that second ability is obviously very nice. If you manage to turn him into, I don't know, a Questing Beast, a Tarmogoyf, that's going to be perfectly fine. And the fact that he is legendary means that you can reuse him with your own Karakas, as well as if you see him later in the game, you can maybe play him to get a look at your opponent's hand, see what you're up against, and then when you hit that 7th land, you can Karakas him back to your hand and play him as Tybalt. I don't expect to be seeing a ton of Valkyrie, but I also feel like a lot of people won't play him because they see that the Cascade rule was changed, and so they think that, like, oh, well, now he's, not very good. No. I think he's perfectly fine. I expect to see him. I don't expect him to see him everywhere. It wouldn't surprise me if people do play him. Wouldn't surprise me if people don't play him. I think he's just a perfectly solid card. And finally, in black, we have Varagoth Bloodsky Sire, who is 2 and a black for a 2/3 legendary demon rogue. He has Death Touch and Boast. Target player searches their library for a card and then shuffles their library and puts that card on top of it. Boast is activate this ability only if this creature attacked this turn and only once each turn. So, first things first, we were discussing with Redane earlier, 2 mana for a 2/3, not at all bad. Doesn't have flying, but does have Death Touch, which is similarly very awkward for people. Your opponent does not want to block this card, but also really wants to block this card because of the Boast. You can activate Boast at any time after it's attacked, which means that you can do it before blocks. It means that you can do it before damage. And very importantly, this is yet again another card where the legendary on it is actually an upside at times. Because the fact that you can attack with impunity when you have your own Karakas in play, so you can get the Boast off before damage, before blocks, and if he gets blocked, you can return him to hand with Karakas if need be. I personally really like Varagoth. I expect to see him see quite a little bit of play in black mid-range decks, especially black mid-range decks that don't have green in them. Because the green mid-range decks are often all about having just aggressively costed creatures and just beating face as much as possible. You're playing 3 mana 4/4s and 4 mana 5/5s and all this sort of stuff. I still expect him to see play in decks like Abzan mid-range, but I think the places where he'll really shine are in decks like Mardu or decks like Orzhov. And yeah, there isn't a ton to say about this guy. I just think that he's really good, and you know he has vampiric shooter strapped to him essentially, / Imperial Seal. Either way, he has a pointed ability strapped to him that you can do repeatedly. I think he's really, really good and shouldn't be underrated. So that does it for black for this set. Again, I really like black in this set. There's no card that I feel is like going to be a mainstay in any particular strategy or any particular deck other than maybe like Egon and Dredge. But all the cards that I've talked about today are at least interesting or cool or like unique designs. Like Varagoth as an example. Like I say, I don't think he's going to become a black mid-range mainstay or anything like that, but that's a really powerful ability to, you know, allow you to do turn after turn after turn. Burning Rune Demon is a card that I fully expect to see across from me, if not, you know, soon, then in a few years, because tutoring for 2 cards in this format is very powerful given all the ways to recur cards, regrow cards, recast cards. And I feel a thing that we're going to see a lot in this set is a lot of cards with obvious power but not an obvious home show up in maybe a year or two as, you know, more cards get added, maybe more cards allow a deck to, you know, come up. Currently, as the Burning Rune Demon, other than Reanimator, doesn't really feel like it has a home, but maybe a new card comes out that changes how Dredge is built, and then all of a sudden the ability to search for 2 cards, putting one of them in is really powerful. Maybe there's a card that comes out that makes Halvar more powerful. Like, there are so many cards in the set that you read them, you understand what they're going to do, but don't necessarily have the ability to do it as efficiently and effectively in Canadian Highlander at the moment, but I feel very easily could become format mainstays if, should the right tools come into the format. On to red. Arnie Brokenbrow. 2 and a red for a 3/3 legendary creature human berserker. Haste. And Boast. Boast is a generic. You may change Arnie Brokenbrow's base power to 1 plus the greatest power among other creatures you control until end of turn. There isn't really a ton to say about Arnie Brokenbrow except put him in your medium red decks. He's very good. He has that Ancient 2 mana, which is so important in that deck. He has Haste, which is also very important in that deck. And that deck is a deck that can play a lot of big creatures quite quickly, and his ability to get even bigger is very nice. That's it. That's Arnie. He's a good boy. He's a quick boy that can be a big boy. Play him in your medium red decks. Now we move on to very possibly the best card in the set, and certainly the card that fills me with both excitement and terror. Burgi. 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 Burgi, God of Storytelling, is 2 and a red for a 3/3 legendary god. Whenever you cast a spell, add red. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. That's it. That's the ability. There's no downside. Creatures you control can boast twice during each of your turns rather than once. Right, cool. Yeah, maybe that'll happen with Arnie in medium red. We'll come back to this. Her reverse side is Harnfell, Horn of Bounty, 4 and a red. For a legendary artifact, discard a card. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. I don't ever really see myself playing Harnfell, but as I will say over and over, I am glad I have the option to play this. In medium red, for example, like a 3 mana 3/3, at some point you're probably not going to need that, so maybe the ability to turn any lands that you draw into a threat, quite nice. So I can see myself playing Harnfell, but I'm never going to go into a game expecting to play Harnfell. Let's talk about Burgi. I love her, and she is terrifying. I have played with this card currently only in Storm. I haven't played her in medium red yet, but I feel that she's going to be at the very least fine. I don't think she's going to be an absolute standout in the deck, but let's face it, that ability is nothing to scoff at. And 3 mana 3/3, yep, of course she passes the vanilla test. In Storm, she is incredible. Storm is obviously a deck that will take basically any good repeatable mana reduction that doesn't also help your opponent. It often plays cards like Jet Medallion. It plays Goblin Electromancer. It plays Baral. And now we have another card that doesn't reduce the cost of spells, but does essentially refund you, a mana off every spell. Obviously, the mana is red, and red isn't a big colour in Storm. Storm is normally like black, blue, and then like there's some red and some green and some white. However, she allows you to save and generate so much mana, as well as giving you the ability to easily cast Underworld Breach. I have often found in Storm that you need to generate so much blue and so much black mana that not often, but sometimes, getting even 1 red mana can be a little bit awkward for you, because you need to crack Black Lotus for multiple black, but you don't have the red. Or you need to use your red mana early so that you can cast your big tutor or such like that while still keeping some blue and some black back. So the fact that she adds red means that now you won't have the issue of getting that red mana for your Underworld Breach, because it will be sitting there. Yeah, play Burgi. Play Burgi in your red decks. Play Burgi in your Storm decks. She's really, really good. Frostbite is a single red for a snow instant. Frostbite deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if you control 3 or more snow permanents, it deals 3 damage instead. I don't expect burn or red deck wins to play this, however, this card is very good in Blue Moon. Blue Moon has, as I said earlier, already been playing Snowlands for Skred, and it will take any damaging spell that it can, really, especially at 1 mana, to deal with aggressive decks, as well as just generally dealing with creatures. That's it. There isn't much to say. Play it in Blue Moon. It is a good card. Speaking of good cards, Goldspan Dragon. 2 red gets you a 4/4 dragon. Flying, haste. Whenever Goldspan Dragon attacks or becomes the target of a spell, create a treasure token. Treasures you control have tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 2 mana of any one colour. In my opinion, the two most important things when it comes to playable dragons in Canadian Highlander is that they have haste, and or they punish your opponent for wanting to deal with them. So, obviously, the best examples, Stormbreath Dragon, Thundermaw Hellkite, and Glorybringer, they all have haste. While dragons like Thunderbreak Regent obviously don't have haste, but they do bolt your opponent whenever they try to kill it. Same with Terror of the Peaks. This does both. It doesn't so much punish your opponent, but you do at least get something back if they deal with it, and if they don't deal with it, it's a 4/4 flying creature with haste that gets you value turn after turn after turn. I think this card is absolutely exceptional, and I think it's a dragon that may break into non-medium red decks. We've seen Blue Moon, for example, play Glorybringer before, and while I think Glorybringer is overall better for that style of deck than Goldspan Dragon, I could see Goldspan Dragon showing up in a few decks like that because of its ability to essentially protect itself with its punishment mechanic. That treasure that you get can be, sacked to play a spell pierce, play a counter spell. And so you can protect Goldspan Dragon very easily, even if you just slam it on turn 5, which is something that most dragons can't actually do. I don't expect it to become a mainstay or anything outside of medium red, but yeah, it's just an extremely strong dragon. Giving you mana is always nice. It does, in a way, protect itself, allowing you to, play spells to protect it, or even letting you apply even more to the board, or hold a burn spell, or something like that. Good dragon play. And finally, for red, we have Taural God of Fury. 2 red gets you a legendary creature god 5/4 with trample. Whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Taural deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. And on the reverse side, we have Taural's Hammer. 1 and a red gets you a legendary artifact equipment. The equipped creature has 1 red, tap, unattach Taural's Hammer. It deals 3 damage to any target, return Taural's Hammer to its owner's hand. The equipped creature gets +3/+0 as long as it's legendary, and it costs 1 and a red to equip. I very much do not expect to have many Taural's Hammers thrown at me, but, and say it with me now, it's nice to have the option. Let's talk about Taural. So, of course, a lot of people, especially Commander players, have pointed out that this is very nice with cards like Blasphemous Act. While there is a deck that plays cards like Blasphemous Act and Star of Extinction in the Canadian Highlander format, it is a little bit of a meme deck, but hey, play Taural, it'll work out well for you. The less memey decks this will go in, I really like this in medium red, and I also like it in just traditional red deck wins, actually. Getting any extra damage out of your burn spells is always really nice, because red decks will often deal 16, 17 points of damage very easily, and then sometimes struggle to get those last points in. And so any extra damage that you can get is extremely welcome. This is also hilarious with cards like Fiery Confluence against a board full of tokens or elves, because of course then you have a bunch of excess damage going at your opponent. A 5/4 Trampler for 4 as well, perfectly fine body, is legendary, doesn't necessarily do anything when it enters the battlefield, a little bit awkward for Karakas, but red is the colour to deal with Karakas between Wasteland, Strip Mine, Blood Moon. Price of Progress punishing them for playing it in the first place. You are really okay against Karakas, and so I don't know how much Taural we're going to see. It may end up being a little bit too slow and a little bit too clunky, but after Hazaret, this is probably the next 4-drop I'd go to for a red deck wins style deck. And so that was red. I'm going to be perfectly honest, red is my least favourite colour in Magic. I find that it's a colour that does very similar things often, especially when it comes to mono. It's the smoke colour a lot of the time. However, as with the previous colours we've seen, I think this set did some really cool design things, especially with the gods. Bergie is arguably the best card in the set and is such a powerful and interesting design. They had this sub-theme of the excess damage. We'll see another card later that talks about excess damage. And I really like that as a way to get value in red while the value still being red. And Goldspan Dragon is Goldspan Dragon. Goldspan Dragon is an absolutely fantastic card that I'm going to die to a lot. So yeah, while I often find red very uninteresting, this set did a lot of things to pique my interest and show me cards that I'm excited to play in the colour. Next up we have green, and we start with Blizzard Brawl. Blizzard Brawl is a single green for a snow sorcery. It says, choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible until end of turn, and then those creatures fight each other. We've come a long way from having to play Prey Upon in mono green decks especially, and in green blue decks like Sorensen. And this is probably the second best Prey Upon plus that we've gotten in recent years. I think Primal Might is an absolutely fantastic card, and even now I don't think it gets the recognition it deserves. That card can win games like near enough single-handedly. This card is no Primal Might, but this card is still very good. Obviously, the issue with fight is that often your creature will die along with theirs, especially if their creature has Death Touch, for example, and is keeping your board at bay, so you just need to kill it. And so obviously Indestructible is very nice about that. The extra power as well can be relevant if it's a high toughness creature that's clogging up your board. You can use it post-combat, for example, to finally finish a creature off, and even if your creature took combat damage, it's not going to die because it's now indestructible. Yeah, I think the card's just extremely flexible. I don't expect to see it in many 2-colour decks, maybe red-green, and certainly not in 3-colour decks, because otherwise it's mostly just going to be a Prey Upon. However, in decks like medium green or in green aggro, and like I say, maybe even in green red, I think this card's very good. But it's definitely in the fight category, I feel, second to Primal Might, so you might not want another fight card, but if you do, this is probably the one I'd go to. Next up, we have Masked Vandal. Masked Vandal is 1 and a green for a 1/3 shapeshifter with Changeling. When Masked Vandal enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. So, first things first, this card is no Reclamation Sage. It may be 1 mana less, but 1 power as opposed to 2 power is extremely relevant. Reclamation Sage can actually be an alright clock, and the fact that Reclamation Sage will always blow something up is very relevant. Obviously, this exiles, whereas Reclamation Sage doesn't, but for a lot of decks, that's not going to be massively relevant. However, the important thing about Reclamation Sage is that Reclamation Sage is, of course, always an elf, whereas Masked Vandal can be a goblin, can be a zombie. Green has quite commonly been a very light splash colour in goblins because of Grumgully from Throne of Eldraine, and this set has given us both Masked Vandal and the card Realm Walker, which I will not be talking about today because it was quite obvious that if you are playing a green tribal deck, you play the green tribal card. And Masked Vandal gives goblins something that they've been sorely lacking, which is the ability to destroy enchantments. And that, along with, you know, the fact that goblins are goblins, the only thing they do nearly as good as killing and attacking is dying, and so you are definitely going to have a goblin in your bin for Master Vandal. A 1/3 as well, like in goblins, is actually like perfectly fine, because obviously you have a bunch of lords to buff its power, and 3 toughness can just slow down opposing aggro decks and stuff, so that's like perfectly fine. But the main thing is the ability for goblins to now deal with enchantments a lot more easily. And I mentioned zombie because of Dredge. I don't know whether this card is going to be massively playable in Dredge, but the fact that this gives a creature, which Dredge can recur the easiest, it gives Dredge a creature that lets them deal with pesky artifacts and enchantments that are slowing them down or outright ruining them a lot of the time. And being a zombie means that you can do stuff like bring back Gravecrawler. It's a 2-mana card as well, so you can also bring it back with Lurus. I expect to see a little bit of Master Vandal, but not a ton. It's not going to replace Reclamation Sage in Elves. It may be added, but I'm not entirely sure. And I don't expect it to see play in wider mid-range decks, because green-white mid-range decks have Night of Autumn, and non-white-green mid-range decks still have Reclamation Sage. However, in the 2 decks that I mentioned, in Dredge and Goblins, I think it's a very nice tool to have. Speaking of very nice tools to have, Snakeskin Veil, a single green for an instant. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. If you play a deck that includes the card Blossoming Defense, you are going to be playing Snakeskin Veil. I've been playing Ranger's Guile for a while. It was in one of my first standard decks, so the printing of Blossoming Defense, so strictly better Ranger's Guile, filled me with joy, and so the printing of yet another strictly better Ranger's Guile fills me with yet further joy. This card can arguably be better than Blossoming Defense if you're expecting to deal regular damage. You probably know already whether or not you're playing this card, and yeah, do so. It's very, very good. Next up, we have Tyvar Kell. Tyvar Kell is 2 green for a legendary planeswalker Tyvar, enters with 3 loyalty, and says, elves you control have tap, add black. +1, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target elf, untap it, it gains Death Touch until end of turn. 0, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. And an ultimate that says -6, you get an emblem with whenever you cast an elf spell, it gains haste until end of turn, and you draw 2 cards. So if you emblem this, you probably win the game, even if you're not a dedicated elf deck, because most of the decks that will want this that aren't dedicated elf decks still play a lot of elves. If you are playing an elf deck, play this, it will be very good for you. And if you are playing a non-dedicated elf deck, but a deck like, say, Hoof, still play this. The +1 will obviously be less relevant. The +1 is worded and does things in such a way that make me feel like they want you to get aggressive with the +1. However, I foresee myself doing very little other than untapping Raphelos, or Elvish Archdruid, or Priest of Titania, elves that create multiple mana and then creating even more mana again. I don't ever see the Death Touch being relevant, but it's nice that it's there. What I see myself doing with this card most, though, is the 0, because the 0, while he's in play, means that that token is a mana dog, but also in Hoof means that you have another body for your Hoof. That's not just an additional +1/+1 to your Hoof, that ends up being an additional +5/+5. And so, yeah. Again, you probably know whether or not you're playing this, but I think he's a really cool design and a much better Elf Matters Planeswalker than Nissa Redane ever was. And finally, just when you thought Tyvar might be the beefiest boy of the set, we have Vorinclex Monstrous Raider, who is 4 green for a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Parator. Trample, haste. If you would, put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, put twice that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. And if an opponent would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. If your opponent is going to +1 a Planeswalker, it ain't getting a loyalty. If your opponent is wanting to tick up their saga, they ain't ticking up their saga. If you are +1ing your Planeswalker, you are in fact +2ing your Planeswalker. If you cast your 6 loyalty Planeswalker, you are putting 12 loyalty on that Planeswalker. Vorinclex is very good. I don't expect him to see play in many decks, but there are certainly decks out there, specifically medium green, that can really take advantage of his abilities. However, in a lot of decks, if you were to play him, he would just end up being essentially green's answer to a dragon, just a hasty trampling 6/6 boy, and so I don't expect him to see play in mid-range decks, for example. But in specifically medium green, I think he's going to be an absolute house. That deck is the Hydra deck after all, and so making your big creatures even bigger without putting any extra effort into them really is always appreciated. And as I say, at worst, he is a hasty 6/6 trampling boy. Vorinclex is very good, Vorinclex is very powerful, but I don't expect to see a ton of him, but I also fully expect to die to him. And that's green. Green has, again, a lot of cool cards. A lot of the cards in the set are very cool. Most of the cards that I'm going to talk about, I personally find really cool. A lot of them have very obvious homes, which is always nice. They don't necessarily go in many decks, but they definitely go in decks. A lot of them are like alternate takes on already existing cards. It's like, hey, you like Blossoming Defensor, play Snakeskin Veil. Hi, you like Primal Might, so play Blizzard Brawl. Tyvarkel obviously goes in Elves, and then you have Masked Vandal that I was really excited to see as someone who likes goblins but has always hated that black-red, which the goblin deck most often is, just can't deal with enchantments, and so sometimes the green would be like, oh, I guess we'll play Rek'Sai, I guess we'll play Abrupt Decay maybe. Now you just have a goblin that just deals with enchantments, which is nice and not irrelevant. Finally, we move on to the gold cards of the set. Unlike the previous colours, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have 10 of these and then 10 artifacts and lands, just because obviously there are a lot more gold cards than there are individual colours, and there's also a decent amount of lands to talk about. So, first up, we have Agar. I'm going to go with Agar. Agar the Freezing Flame. 1 blue-red, gets you a 3/3 legendary creature giant wizard, and whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess damage, if a giant, wizard, or spell you controlled dealt damage to it this turn, draw a card. I don't think we're going to be seeing a ton of Agar in any deck, really. However, I'm always a fan and always want to see work these kind of blue-red tempo, get more value out of your card creatures. Jorian the Ruin Diver from Oath of the Gatewatch, I believe. It's a card that I loved for many years, but never really managed to make work in a deck. This was admittedly before I played Canadian Highlander, and from what I've seen, she did see a little bit of Canadian Highlander play. But she's certainly fallen by the wayside in recent years, and I think that's what's going to happen with Agar. I don't see many decks playing him. However, that ability is very powerful, that ability is very good. The fact that the card doesn't have to have died, whether it's a creature or a planeswalker, from the giant wizard or spell, it just has to have been dealt damage that turn by one of those things, makes him a lot better. It means that you can, for instance, say lightning bolt a planeswalker before killing it with, say, a Delver of Secrets, or similarly, you can attack with, say, multiple creatures at a planeswalker, and just so long as one of those creatures was a giant or wizard, then, and, you know, it gets overkilled, you are going to be drawing a card. So as I say, don't expect to be seen in a ton of decks, but if a player on, say, Blue-Red X Tempo did play this against me, I wouldn't scoff at them. I think it's a really cool card, but just not good enough to see regular play. Next up, we have Arnie Slays the Troll, which is red and green for a saga. Target, the first chapter, target creature you control fights up to one target creature you don't control. Second chapter, add red, put 2+1/+1 counters on up to one target creature you control. And the third chapter, you gain life equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. As mentioned earlier, fight cards recently have become a lot better and therefore see a lot more play. And while I don't think this is a particularly great fight spell, it is a decent one. You obviously get more value out of it. The first chapter is literally just a Prey Upon, that in this case will cost you 2 mana, so obviously not as good, but obviously you do get those 2 extra abilities. The second one of which is quite relevant. The add a red may seem a little bit strapped on, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful. Obviously, it means that on turn 3 you can have 4 mana, which could be quite relevant for, literally playing a 4-drop or playing 2/2-drops, being able to play, say, a 3-drop and then have a pump spell or protection spell at the ready. Getting a +1/+1 counter on a creature, obviously in the decks that this is going to see play, so, red-green, stompy style decks. I don't think it's going to be seen in, this card's going to be seen in red-green aggro, but you could play it in red-green aggro, and then again, +1/+1 counter is always nice for making creatures bigger. And that third ability, you're not playing it for this, but it's always nice to have a little bit of life gain, and I don't think your opponent's really going to be blowing this up, so so long as you still have a creature in play by the time this resolves, that's just some nice gravy on top to maybe make combat maths a little bit awkward in more aggressive mirrors, or, just as a little bit of a bumper against, the opposing decks. There isn't really a ton to be said about this card, but I think it's perfectly fine, if not particularly flashy and nothing to write home about. Wouldn't surprise me to see this card show up every now and again, but it also wouldn't surprise me if I never saw this card hit a table. Next up, we have Binding the Old Gods. 2 black and a green, gets you a saga. The first chapter, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Second chapter, search your library for a forest card, put it into the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. Notably, it doesn't say basic. And chapter 3, creatures you control gain Death Touch until end of turn. I, again, don't expect this to see a ton of play. However, in especially green-black midrange is often, depending on the build, especially if it's more a Planeswalker-heavy build, it's often essentially a control deck, and that deck has played things like the 5-mana Vraska from Return to Ravnica, just because it's 5 mana blow up a permanent, and then you still get some stuff out of it later on. And this is very similar. It's 4 mana, blow up anything that isn't a land. That's obviously great. You can blow up a Planeswalker creature or whatever. The ability to search for any forest means that you can obviously get Overgrown Tomb, you can get Bayou, you can get Murmuring Bosk or Indatha Triome if that's your thing. And the third chapter, in the decks that this could see play, I don't really expect that chapter to ever come up, but you never know. Maybe you've got a Llanowar Elves in play and you just want to get in a little bit of chip damage, I don't know. So yeah, again, I don't think this card is especially flashy, but I do like the card. Murmuring Bosk is kind of one of my pet cards, and so any card that lets me get Murmuring Bosk gets me a little bit excited, I'm not going to lie, so I am a little bit biased towards this card. But yeah, similar to Arnie Breaks the Troll, it's a card that I fully expect to see at some point, but at the same time wouldn't be surprised to basically never see. A card that I would be surprised to never see, however, Thurya. I'm going to go with Thurya. Thurya's Retribution, 1 white, white, black, gets you a saga. Chapter 1, create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. Second chapter, until end of turn, angels you control gain tap. Destroy target creature with power less than this creature's power. And chapter 3, angels you control gain double strike until end of turn. I absolutely love this card. This is one of my favourite cards from the set. Unfortunately, I have not found a home for it yet. However, I think that there is definitely a, say, more mid-rangey style of Death and Taxes that maybe splashes black that could see this, and in Orzhov mid-range I think this is going to be very good, because that deck often plays quite a few angels, like Restoration Angel, Glorious Protector that we mentioned earlier, and maybe even at the top end you see Liesa from Commander Legends, or a Lyra Dawnbringer, for example. But just on its own, 4 mana for a 4/4 angel, like that's a perfectly fine rate. It's nothing to write home about, but it's fine. And then that angel becomes a removal spell for a creature with 3 or less power. It doesn't say less than or equal to, it just says less than, so it destroys 3 power creatures or less. But there are plenty of 3 or less power creatures in the format that you'd be happy to destroy. And then, yeah, after that, your aggressive angel becomes essentially very big for a turn. The angel also has vigilance, which obviously works really well with that second ability, so you get to attack, and then if there's, say, a blocker in the way before damage, you can obviously tap it and blow that up. I think this card's really, really cool, and I also think that there is room in the format for a Esper Blink style deck, or a deck that, you know, likes to reuse creatures over and over, and that deck can very well play a few cards that flicker permanents, not just creatures. Amanatu the Fate Shifter, one of my favourite planeswalkers of all time, is a card that comes to mind, and this is a very nice target for cards like Amanatu. Being able to repeatedly make angels over and over, as well as obviously getting that second chapter, so you can blow creatures up, you know, several turns in a row. This card has a lot of potential, and I really like it a lot, and as I say, not entirely sure what its home is at the moment, but if there isn't one yet, I'm really hoping there is one in the future, and I will be looking to make a home for it. Next up, we have Immersturm Predator. 2 black-red gets you a 3/3 Vampire Dragon, flying. Whenever Immersturm Predator becomes tapped, exile up to one target card from a graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on Immersturm Predator. Sacrifice another creature, Immersturm Predator gains indestructible until end of turn. Let's get this out of the way. I think this card goes in Aristocrats. I don't think it's an especially great card in the Aristocrats, but at the end of the day, it is a decent body, and it is a free sack outlet, which of course is very important in those decks. The fact it taps itself to protect itself is unfortunate, but at the end of the day, you still have the creature. So, you know, it being tapped is unfortunate, but it could be a lot worse. You could not have the creature at all. And also just the sort of the incidental graveyard hate of this card, I think, is also quite nice. Obviously, it doesn't just have to be tapped from its ability. You can, when you attack with it, you also get to exile cards, and so a little bit, you know, a nice little bit of graveyard hate is always cool. Exiling, I don't know, Swords to Plowshares or whatever from opponent's bin whenever you attack, just so that your creatures that would like to die end up doing so rather than getting exiled. Always nice. And yeah, I don't think this card is going to blow many minds, but a decent body with a free sack outlet is, in my opinion, pretty much what Aristocrats decks are often looking for, and so I think this is going to be right at home in those decks. Next, we have Kaya the Inexorable. 3 white-black gets you a legendary planeswalker Kaya with 5 starting loyalty. +1. Put a ghost form counter on up to one target non-token creature it gains. When this creature dies or is put into exile, return it to its owner's hand and create a 1/1 white spirit creature token. -3, exile target non-land permanent. And -7, you get an emblem with, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may cast a legendary spell from your hand, from your graveyard, or from among cards you own in exile without paying its mana cost. I don't know how good Kaya really is, but given that cards, like I mentioned earlier, the Return to Ravnica, Vraska the Unseen, I want to say, Vraska the Unseen does see a little bit, but not a ton of play in our format, and Kaya does a very similar job, albeit obviously in a different colour. Vraska's obviously Golgari, this is Orzhov. However, I think that this card does a lot of good things for fair decks. It's just whether or not those fair decks want to play her in the first place. For example, I don't think that we'll be seeing a ton of her in Abzan, because Abzan's 5-drop slot is very, very stacked. You've got cards like Thragtusk, cards like Elder Gargaroth. If you want to go a Lance route, you've got Titania. Not to mention a few other 5-mana planeswalkers and the like. However, in straight black-white mid-range, or say in a white Death and Taxes deck with some black in there, I think this card could be right at home. Maybe not. Maybe it turns out to be too expensive and doesn't really do enough. It doesn't really do anything with nothing on board, for example. However, her ability to deal with literally anything, allow you to recycle your creatures we mentioned like earlier with the sword half of Halvor, being able to make your Recruit of the Guard, Stoneforgers and whatnot block and then come right back to your hand is very good. And then you also get a 1/1 white spirit out the deal, which is nothing to scoff at. And although you should never look at a Planeswalker's ultimate as something you're expecting to get, if you do get this ultimate in decks like Daffodil and Taxes or Orzhov midrange that play a lot of legendary creatures and often other planeswalkers, that ultimate is very, very powerful in long grinding games, which is often what white-black decks are looking to do. Next up, we have Coma Cosmos Serpent. 3 green, green, blue, blue gets you a 6/6 legendary creature serpent. This spell can't be countered. At the beginning of each upkeep, create a 3/3 blue serpent creature token named Coma's Coil. Sacrifice another serpent, choose one. Tap target permanent, its activated abilities can't be activated this turn, or Coma Cosmos Serpent gains indestructible until end of turn. I don't expect Coma to see a lot of play. For example, I do not think that this is a reanimation target. Reanimator decks do not need a card like this. They already have stuff like Grave Titan, which is also hard castable, and Reanimator is often a toolbox style deck, and so you don't really play many creatures that are sort of one-man armies, and as I say, Grave Titan is already there and already more than enough, I feel, for that style of deck. However, where I do like this deck is in turns decks. Turns decks often have an issue with reliable threats, and the fact that this spell can't be countered means that it is going to resolve. And obviously, every upkeep making a 3/3 is very nice. The 3/3 obviously protects the Coma. It's not perfect. Coma is obviously legendary, which means it can be Caracased. It only gains indestructible, not hexproof. So again, things like Caracas, but also things like swords and stuff like that can deal with it quite nicely. So I don't expect to see a ton of Coma, but I would also be shocked if I didn't see it every so often in the format. We'll have to see if there's any other deck that likes this card, but really, I think the only deck that I immediately think of for this card is the turns decks. Next up, we have Narfi Betrayer King. Narf. 3 blue black gets you a legendary snow zombie wizard. 4/3. Over snow and zombie creatures you control get +1/+1, and for snow, return Narfi Betrayer King from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you're playing zombies, cool, put this in. You don't need me to tell you that. That's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about that second ability, the return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. I think that this could see a place in Blue Moon decks. As we discussed, Blue Moon already plays Snowlands, and so, you know, your mana is very easily going to be able to activate that last ability. And also, quite importantly, blue-red, as we mentioned earlier, is like, it's the colour of looting and rummaging. You've got Faithless Looting, you've got Careful Study, you've got the Royal Scions, you've got Dak Faden, you've got the new Teferi. There are other cards that I'm blanking on right now. Even Desolate Lighthouse, if you go that deep. It's very easy to get this guy into your graveyard, and then you just have a repeatable threat that can threaten opponents' planeswalkers, which, especially for Blue Moon, is something that they've struggled with, especially since the change to damage redirection rule. And so I think that Narfi could be a little bit of a sleeper for decks like that. I don't really expect to see it in many other decks, maybe in a mono-black deck, just because, again, you can discard this to a Liliana Veil, Collective Brutality, something like that, and get it back quite easily because you're a mono deck, so you can obviously easily make your mana base mostly snow mana. But yeah, it's a card that I fully expect to die to at some point, and maybe not in the decks that you would immediately expect from a Zombie Lord. Next up, we have Nico Aris. X, white, blue, blue for a 3 loyalty legendary planeswalker Nico. When Nico enters the battlefield, you create X shard tokens, and shard tokens are enchantment tokens with 2 generic, sacrifice this enchantment, scry 1, then draw a card. +1, up to 1 target creature you control can't be blocked this turn, and whenever that creature deals combat damage this turn, you return it to its owner's hand. -1, Nico deals 2 damage to target tapped creature for each card you've drawn this turn, and -1, you create another shard token. This is obviously not a planeswalker for traditional blue-white control decks or the like. This Nico requires you really to be playing creatures. You want to be getting that plus repeatedly. The -2 is nice for control, and obviously the shards are nice, but a white blue card that essentially draws you cards later on. Sphinx's Revelation is already seeing less and less play because it's turning out to be a little bit slow and clunky, and I don't think that Nico is any exception to that rule, for lack of a better word, at the moment. Where I do like Nico is in that Esper Blinky style deck that I mentioned earlier. Being able to reuse your Enter the Battlefield creatures, reset something like Avenza Shaper Savant, for example, I think is really cool. And obviously they let you get in the chip damage because it makes the creature unblockable as well. Nico is a planeswalker that I would not be shocked to not see much play, but at the same time wouldn't be surprised if we do at some point see an Esprit mid-range style deck, or even a straight up blue-white one with blink effects and stuff like and the like. We could also possibly see Nico show up in Bant Blink. There they will obviously bounce a lot of token makers and value creatures back. So yeah, I don't expect to see a ton of Nico, but I would be surprised if we don't see any of them. And the final gold card is the good boy, Sarulf Realm Eater. 1 black-green gets you a 3/3 legendary creature wolf. Whenever a permanent an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on Sarulf Realm Eater. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if Sarulf has 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may remove all of them. If you do, exile each other non-land permanent with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of counters removed this way. Having played with a little bit of Sarulf in both Abzan midrange and 4-color Blood, that last ability is not an ability that I have nor expect to use very often. However, it is a nice option to have. There are cards like True Name Nemesis, Platinum Empyrean, and the like that can make combat really awkward for you, can make attacking or blocking really awkward, and so just having the ability to, you know, refresh the board if need be is always nice. That first ability is where Sarulf really shines, because he's in green-black. In green-black-white, there's going to be a bit more exiling because of the presence of cards like Sword and Path and lot, but a lot of the time you're going to be destroying a lot of creatures with your Fatal Pushes, your Blood Chiefs first, Vindicates, Abrupt Decays. There is going to be so much stuff being blown up that he's going to become a very big boy very quickly. He doesn't have evasion, but a lot of the time green-black decks are very good at dealing with blockers, and it's just about dealing damage with big creatures, which green-black X mid-range, especially Abzan mid-range, is absolutely fantastic at. That is the deck of, the 2 mana 4/5s, or the 2 mana 2/2s that grow bigger, the 3 mana 4/4s, the 4 mana 5/5s, etc., etc. So, yeah. Don't expect Sarulf to be ungodly powerful or anything like that, but he's going to be a perfectly decent creature with, like, say, a very nice built-in panic button should your opponent play something like a True Name Nemesis that can really make the game awkward for you. Now we move on to the artifacts and lands section of the review, and there is only one artifact card that we are talking about in the set, but it is a doozy. Pyre of Heroes is 2 generic for an artifact, 2 and tap, sacrifice creature. Search your library for a creature card that shares a creature type with the sacrifice's creature and has converted mana cost equal to 1 plus that creature's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, shuffle your library, activate this only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Tribal decks are obviously going to love this. The main tribal deck that I have found that this works in very well is Goblins, because Goblins is already a bit of a toolboxy style deck and also a bit of a combo deck. So obviously being able to find specific goblins for whether it's the combo or for dealing with particular threats, doing particular things, is always very nice. The fact that when this enters you don't have to choose a creature type, which a lot of sort of tribal matters cards do, also means that this card is very flexible for different lines as you go along the chain. For instance, the Kiki-Jiki combo in Goblins often uses Zealous Conscript, which obviously isn't a goblin, but it is a warrior. And a lot of goblins in the goblin deck are also warriors. Several of the 4 mana ones, for instance, are warriors, and so you can turn those 4 mana goblin warriors into the 4 mana human warrior that is Zealous Conscript. And then the Zealous Conscripts can enter, untap the Pyre of Heroes, and if you have the mana and another 4 mana goblin, that 4 mana goblin can become a Kiki-Jiki, and then you can very quickly attack your opponent with infinite 3/3s. There are also various lines where you essentially change a creature type as you go along. You can turn a non-human cleric into a human cleric, and then change that human cleric into a human something else, and that can allow chains in cards like Sandra Bullock, the Pattern Rector deck of the format. There are also some neat combos you can do with the mages with this card. For instance, if you already have this card in play and you get a Trinket Mage, you can play Trinket Mage, go and get Black Lotus, and then turn the Trinket Mage into an Auriok Salvages, and then you have infinite mana. or you can play, I believe it's Treasure Mage, the one from Modern Horizons that searches for exactly a 2-drop, and that finds this, and then if you have enough way to find Black Lotus, then you can turn the mage again to Auriok Salvagers, get infinite mana, and things like that. There are plenty of interesting combos that you can do with this card, and the fact that it doesn't make you pick exactly one creature type at the time means that you can be a lot more tricksy with it than people may at first think. This card isn't a birthing pod, but it does a damn good impression in the right decks, and I like this card a lot. Now we have Faceless Haven, the first land we'll be looking at. Snowland. Tap, add colorless. Snow, snow, snow. Faceless Haven becomes a 4/3 creature with vigilance and all creature types until end of turn. It's still a land. This is probably the third best colorless creature land in my opinion. The two best obviously being Mutavault and Mishra's Factory, and then we also had Snow something Bastion from Modern Horizons. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name right now. I think this is better than the Bastion. The Bastion was a 2/3 that when it blocked kept the creature tapped down and maybe tapped it down itself. I can't 100% remember. But yeah, 4 power is just infinitely better than being able to freeze your opponent's creature. It is obviously a little bit clunkier because it requires 3 snow mana rather than the 1 for Bastion, but that's fine. A 4/3 will trade up with a lot of things. I don't think this goes in every deck. For instance, I don't play this in Goblins, just because, again, like, playing too many colorless decks, especially in a deck like Goblins that's so pip dense, it can be a little bit awkward. And also, I don't expect to see this in Elf decks. For example, Elf decks don't even play Mutavault. That's not the type of game plan that they're going for. However, in monocolor decks, I think this card is perfectly fine. 4/3 is a decent body. You can get your opponent dead quite quickly with it. And so yeah, I expect to see this card quite a bit, but just don't stick it in any tribal deck or any monocolor deck. You want an effect like this, especially given that is quite a cost to activate it in the first place. Next up we have a few lands from the Uncommon cycle this set. All of them enter tapped and all of them do something by sacrificing themselves. So this is Gates of Istfell. It adds white, and for 2 white, blue, blue, tap, sacrifice Gates of Istfell. You gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. A lot of people are very excited for this card, but personally I don't see it. I compare this card to Memorial to Genius, which was also 5 mana. It also entered the battlefield tapped. It added blue rather than white, and also cost 5 mana tapping and sacking it to draw 2 cards. It didn't gain the 2 life, and don't get me wrong, the 2 life could be relevant, but for the most part, I've never really seen that land see play, and I don't see why people are suddenly excited for this one just because it also gains you 2 life. I think quite a few people who are excited for this have forgotten that Memorial to Genius exists, and have forgotten that we already have an example of a land that really isn't particularly playable because it's just not worth the awkwardness of entering tapped and doesn't really do enough to warrant including an awkward tap land in your deck. Then we have Great Hall of Starnheim, also enters the battlefield tapped, adds black. White, white, black, sacrifice Great Hall of Starnheim and a creature you control. Create a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance. Activate only anytime you could cast a sorcery. Obviously, that last line of text of activating only as a sorcery is very unfortunate. It means that you can't save, in a sense, your creature for removal spell and instead turn it into an angel. So it means that you need to proactively sacrifice the creature, which a lot of decks don't really want to be doing. So I don't expect to see this in a mid-range deck, for example, but where I do very possibly expect to see this played is in Aristocrats decks. Obviously, a lot of the Aristocrat-style creatures have a body up front and then a weak token creature on the flip side. And a lot of the time, you don't really care about that body, except for the fact that, you know, you get more value out of it from your sacrifice effects and such. And so turning, say, a random 1/1 human token that you've got from a creature into a real threat of a 4/4 flying vigilant angel is pretty good. Wouldn't surprise me if people didn't play this card in their Aristocrats decks. Wouldn't surprise me if people did play this card in their Aristocrats decks. Like, it's sort of personal preference. I think the card is perfectly fine, but again, the phrase that comes up a lot, it's nothing to write home about, so give it a go if you feel like it. Now we have a Port of Carfell. Enters battlefield tapped again, tap to add blue, 3 blue, black, black, sacrifice Port of Carfell, mill 4 cards, then return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is quite obviously a reanimator card, and it's a reanimator card that I don't think you're actually going to be activating very often, but it is very nice to have if you need it. It both doesn't target, which is very relevant in a world where cards like Cling to Dust and Deathrite Shaman exist, but also the fact that it mills 4 cards means that in the desperate times where your opponent has exiled all of your graveyard or has a Scavenging Ooze in bin, so you just can't get a creature in your graveyard save the life, it's a nice Hail Mary to be able to try and get something. Obviously, it's not great, but given it is going to be in blue-black, you can maybe brainstorm a creature to the top of your library and then, you know, mill it, get it out. Unlikely to come up, mainly given they don't see play in Reanimator for fairly obvious reasons, but it also allows you to reanimate a creature that shuffles itself in when it hits the graveyard. So if for some strange reason you are playing a blue-black deck with, say, an Eldrazi in it, then yeah, you can reanimate those cards with this. Unlikely to come up, but it might well do. And the final land from the cycle that we're going to be talking about is Surtland Frostpire, which just sounds like the weirdest D&D name. Enters battlefield tapped, taps to add red, and 2 blue, blue, red, tap, sacrifice Surtland Frostpire, scry 2. Surtland Frostpire deals 2 damage to each creature. Activate this only any time you could cast a sorcery. More and more Blue Moon has been dropping back to basics from its deck because there's been a lot more non-basic lands that we'd really like to play. There's been a lot more decks that are able to play around back to basics, and also just while Blood Moon restricts the type of mana you produce, you still have that mana available, whereas Back to Basics, if you are unfortunate enough to draw a lot of your non-basic lands, Back to Basics will screw you over. It will, you know, actively detract from the mana that you have. So more and more I've seen people, myself included, dropping Back to Basics from those decks, and so now we can play with the, some cool non-basic lands that give us some handy effects that could come up. So, for instance, Desolate Lighthouse is a land that I'm a big proponent of in Blue Moon, and this card seems perfectly fine. The fact that it has Scry 2 tapped on it means that even if you're in a matchup where it's not going to be particularly good, if you're really desperate for, looking for just like one particular card, you've got that. And dealing 2 damage to each creature, as we established earlier, sometimes Blue Moon decks just need that extra little bit of damage to deal with a big creature, or again, it's a sweeper for smaller creatures. I don't think it's going to be a card with many, oh my god, and then they activated Surtland Frostpire and the game was changed, but it's a nice effect to have, and it is relatively free. Even though it's on a tapped land, it is still on a land, so you're not using a card for this effect, which is always nice. And now we have one of the more interesting cards lands in the set. We have Tyrite Sanctum. Tap to add colours. 2 and tap. Target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. And 4 tap. Sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum. Put an indestructible counter on target god. The only deck I really expect to see any play in is Death and Taxes. That deck plays a lot of legendary creatures, and also a lot of legendary creatures that are quite small. Thalias, for example, and Cambals. So putting +1/+1 counters on them is very relevant, and if your opponent has a board wipe, having that second ability can be quite nice to save, say, your Thalia from a Wrath against the control deck, or your Cambal against a Lightning Bolt or a Fatal Push from a Storm deck. Unfortunately, however, the legendary creatures are still Karakasable, so against certain decks, and bounceable in other ways, exilable, etc, etc. So, as LRR says, it's not perfect system. There are obviously plenty of ways around that indestructible counter, but making your Silver Bullet legendary creatures against the right deck even more resilient is always nice. Storm, for example, doesn't really have many ways to deal with an indestructible Cambal. Some builds of it play Teferi, and there are cards like Chain of Vapor and the like to bounce it, but those are particular cards to find, and while you have a Cambal in play, especially against Storm, they often don't have much time or, resources to be able to find the card without also taking a bunch of damage. So that last ability is relevant, but I don't think it's as relevant as it could be in a format where Karakas is so prevalent. And last but not least, before we get to the final two land cycles of the set, we have the World Tree. Enters the battlefield tapped, taps to add green. As long as you control 6 or more lands, lands you control have tap, add 1 mana of any colour. And then for white, white, blue, blue, black, black, red, red, green, green, tap, sacrifice the World Tree. Search your library for any number of God cards, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So obviously Obelisk the Tormentor is going to be banned. But in all seriousness, I don't think this card is very good. I was very excited for this card, and I've tried it out in land decks, I've tried it out in mid-range decks, and it's never felt worth the inclusion. The fact it enters tapped is obviously an actual cost. If it entered untapped, then obviously it would be very free, and I think it would be fine. But that ability of your lands adding 1 mana of any colour, by the time you've got 6 lands in play in most decks, you're normally fine, and a lot of the decks that are like 4+ colour and such aren't wanting a green land that enters the battlefield tapped and doesn't do anything until you've got 6 lands. Decks like 4-color Scapeshift is a deck that this card could maybe see playing. However, I don't think it needs it. That card already has Dryad of the Elysian Grove and Prismatic Omen, both of which obviously already make your lands tap for any colour, as well as actually interacting in a relevant manner with cards like Valakut. So I don't think this card is very relevant. That last ability is essentially never going to come up in this format. There's never going to be a 5-color God deck in this format, and if it is, it's going to be the memeiest of meme decks. So I don't expect this card to see any real play. It wouldn't shock me to see someone play it, just because that ability of making your lands tap for any colour is nice on paper, but I feel in practice it's not worth it. Our second to last card is the rest of the pathway cycle in Kaldheim. If you don't know about this land cycle, they're all modal double-faced, and they all tap for 1 colour on the front and a different colour on the back. So for example here we have Hengeway Pathway and the blue one, the name of which I've forgotten. It's white on one side and it's blue on the other. I personally really don't like these lands. I like my dual lands to, be true dual lands to tap for multiple mana. That being said, in aggressive decks and in combo decks, I think that they do have their place, especially in decks. Storm, for example, I play the blue-black one, because Storm is very much a blue-black deck that also happens to include some red, maybe some white, maybe some green. And so having a land that gives you your 2 main colours and lets you, untapped, and get the colour that you need at the time is quite nice. That being said, I would also like it if, I opened up a Darkslick Shores instead, and then later on in the game it can be a little bit awkward having a land that's just blue and doesn't tap for black, or a land that's just black and doesn't tap for blue. So I'm personally not a huge fan of these lands. I know quite a few people are, so more power to them. Feel free to play them if you like them, and if you don't like them, I don't think anyone's really going to judge you. And finally, we have the new dual lands. All of them are snow, all of them have 2 basic land types, and all of them enter the battlefield tapped. So for instance, Volatile Fjord here, snow land, island mountain, taps for blue or red, ETBs tapped. I don't expect these cards to see a ton of play, especially with the triomes in existence. I feel that the triomes do a very similar job to these. They will often add a superfluous colour, but the fact that if you draw them later, you can cycle them is just very nice. So for example, speaking of Death and Taxes, we now have another black-white dual land. And I don't play it. Instead, I play the Abzan Triome, which I believe is in Dartha Triome. Because again, in Death and Taxes is a deck that later in the game really doesn't want to be seeing, a 6th, 7th, etc. land. And so being able to cycle it and draw a card is just significantly better than having a land that can't do that. I will say the 3rd colour can sometimes come up, especially if that 3rd colour is mountain, because of the existence of goblins, but, in the case of Indartha Triome, I'm adding forest to the deck, and unless elf players suddenly start becoming more popular and playing, I forget its name, is it Elvis Champion, the elf that gives Forest Walk? That forest isn't going to come up more. However, back to the lands we are actually talking about. Like I say, I don't expect these to see a ton of play. However, I specifically chose Volatile Fjord because Volatile Fjord is one of the few that I expect to see a little bit of play, because again, Blue Moon decks have been dropping back to basics, so playing non-basics isn't a bad thing, and they like snow mana, and they currently don't have the Tango lands or the Bicycle lands, and therefore having another blue-red duel is something that that deck is perfectly happy playing. If you need cheaper lands, like, cheap lands, I think that you can do better than these in Canadian Highlander. But, yeah, I feel like they're perfectly fine. Scapeshift may play them just because, again, more mountains for Scapeshift is always good. But other than that, and like I say, fringe decks like Blue Moon who want snow specifically, I don't expect these lands to see a ton of play. And that is my set review for Kaldheim. Thank you very much for joining me. I like this set a lot. I think this set has, in terms of playables, it's got a decent amount, but it also has a lot of cards, as we discussed, that either maybe don't have a home yet, but just read as very powerful, very unique cards that I think someday will find their way into a deck. And in some situations like Auvar could very well be uh, a card that whatever deck that is ends up revolving around. I think the set is really cool. I absolutely love the flavour. Cards like Redane and Bergie I absolutely adore. And yeah, I think the set was really good. It doesn't appear to have broken the format in any massive way, unlike some of, sets from the previous couple of years. And I'm really excited to play more with these cards, especially Redane. Redane is one of my favourite white creatures that have been printed in a while. But yeah, that is really it for this set. Thank you very much for joining me. You can find me at Force of Wilko on Twitter. Thank you so much for getting through all of this. It took a lot longer than I was expecting. I thought that I would be able to get this done in an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and yeah, it's a little bit longer than that by the looks. But until then, I will see you guys in 2 weeks where we will be talking Strixhaven. Thank you very, very much.